So once the Constitution is ratified, it's essentially a restart on the American government system. George Washington is elected as president unanimously, the only president to ever be unanimously elected, and he puts together a cabinet, which are the head of his executive departments. Most importantly, the men that you're going to need to know are the men on the screen in front of you: Alexander Hamilton, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, who's Secretary of State. It's important to know that's not Secretary of any one state. It means in charge of foreign affairs. George Washington has no political affiliation. He actually sees the merits of both what Jefferson is saying and what Hamilton is saying, although he has a longer history with Hamilton, who served as his right-hand man during the American Revolution. And the people that tend to follow Hamilton's vision for America are those that came out of the Federalist idea of putting the Constitution together, that America needs a strong central government, that it needs a complex commercial economy, that it needs to essentially be a player in world affairs. In essence, trying to build another Britain. The Jeffersonians, who will later on be called the Democratic Republicans or the Republicans, they come out of the anti-federalist tradition, but it's important to know the anti-federalists are not a political party. These are the people that don't deny that there should be a central government, but they believe that the state governments should have much more power so that the states are not overrun by a strong, potentially oppressive central authority. They also are very skeptical about a commercial economy. It's not that they're against manufacturing per se, but what they're against is the idea that if manufacturing and industry take over, people would have to move to the cities to be part of that, and then they would lose their independence of working outside for themselves and for Mother Nature. While Washington doesn't claim to be part of sort of either philosophy, his actions tend to suggest that he does support a stronger central government. Again, if you cut him open, you'd probably find that he bled more Federalist, but he believed that the president should sort of be aloof and distant from the squabbles beneath. This allowed Hamilton to really take a very important lead role. And Hamilton's interesting because he comes from the Caribbean, he's an illegitimate child, he's poor, but when he comes and makes his name in America, he really takes on this idea that there's an importance in aristocracy, that wealthy people will run this country. But his question is, how do I get wealthy people to be invested in the success of this country? Because only then, he believed, can the national government actually have any enduring life. It all comes down to his plan, which again we call Fat White Bus Man. And the F is for funding at par. It's the idea there were a bunch of people who had gotten IOUs from the government to help fight the American Revolution. And after the Revolution, these IOUs weren't even worth the full amount. And so Hamilton said we ought to pay them back, quote, at face value or full value or, quote, funding at par. Now, this was controversial because the government, up until that point, didn't have the money to do so. So how were they going to actually be able to pay them back at full value? But Hamilton said, if we do this and we show that America pays back its debts, people will loan us money in the future. Now, the people that went out and bought up all of those IOUs, these speculators, did take a risk. They didn't know for a fact that Congress would pass this. But when they did pass it, they made quite a nice penny on it. Now, the A is for assumption of state debts. Now, the northern states, not the southern states, still had debt well after the Revolution. Most of the southern states had less debt during the Revolution because of the fact that they used slaves. But they also had worked to pay off the debt after the Revolution. Now, assuming state debts is where the federal government actually would go to the states and say, we will absorb your debt. You no longer owe this money to people. We will owe this money to people. Now, the idea that Hamilton had was if rich people who were owed money actually were owed money by the federal government, they would have skin in the game. They would have an investment in the federal government and would do whatever they could to allow the federal government to survive. The issue, however, with funding and assumption is it requires a bunch of money to pay back these IOUs or these bigger IOUs in terms of assumption. So where was the money going to come from? Part of it was going to come from a tariff. Now, Hamilton envisioned this tariff serving two purposes. One is it would raise revenue to be able to deal with the F and the A, but at the same time, it would be able to help protect American industry. Tariffs make it so that goods coming in from outside the country cost more, which make it more desirable to buy American products. The other way to generate revenue was the white part, okay? It's the WHI for whiskey, the T for tax, and the E as a reminder that's called an excise tax. And this was a tax that was placed on distillers of alcohol, mostly whiskey distillers. That's where it gets the name. Now, the issue here was that many whiskey distillers were way out in the West. These were farmers who took their excess grain and turned it into whiskey. That wasn't actually their main job, but it was the way that they made some extra money. Well, the tax on them was disproportionately more than the major distillers, people like George Washington. So it was making money mostly off of the backs of farmers, and at the same time, it was sort of a sin tax, S-I-N-T-A-X, in terms of actually, if alcohol is bad, we can tax people on making alcohol while at the same time increasing revenue. But the big issue overall, the biggie, is the bus, or BOTUS. Now, Hamilton argued that it was necessary and proper to have a national bank, that the federal government should charter a bank because, according to the Constitution, the federal government had the power to coin money and collect taxes, and having a bank would be very helpful in executing these official responsibilities. Now, again, it's not written in the Constitution that there should be a federal bank. And so Jefferson countered by saying, no, no, no. If it's not explicitly written in the Constitution, then that power belongs to the states according to the 10th Amendment, or the Reserved Powers Amendment. So in the end, what part of Fat White Busman actually succeeded or was passed? Well, funding at par was passed. Assumption of state debts did happen. The whiskey tax did happen, and it ultimately inflamed a small rebellion. BOTUS passed very controversially and actually was quite successful in terms of getting investors. But a part that we also want to understand is, and even to get the assumption plan passed, there was really a compromise that had to be reached. The North was going to get their assumption. That means the northern states now were released essentially from their debt. The southern states who'd already paid down their debt, who didn't like that idea, they got the capital at Washington, D.C. It's important to note that as part of this bank struggle, you see the beginning of this idea of how to interpret the Constitution. Now, Federalists believed in loose construction or loose interpretation. Namely, we're looking at the spirit or the intent of the Constitution. We're not necessarily looking word for word, whereas the Democratic Republicans were much more strict constructionists, saying, we're literalists. You got to be able to find it in there. Now, loose construction won out when it came to the bank, and we're going to see this continued question of how do we interpret the Constitution going forward for a considerable period of time after that. After all the parts of Hamilton's plan had been affirmed and had been passed, you did see some resistance out west in terms of the Whiskey Rebellion. You had a bunch of small farmers who refused to pay this tax, and much in the spirit that we saw in the Stamp Act, they tarred and feathered the tax collectors. But unlike what we saw with Shays' Rebellion, where the folks in Boston turned to the central government and also turned to the state government and said, what are you going to do about these rebels out west? And they felt like nothing could be done, and ultimately they had to hire armed soldiers themselves. Washington and Hamilton weren't going to have a sort of redux of that particular Shays' Rebellion. So they call out about 13,000 troops to put down a very tiny rebellion force, and they go out to western Pennsylvania and they show them who's boss. It's the famous killing a fly with an Uzi. But at the same time, it's showing the country this is not a weak central government anymore. This is going to be a strong central authority who should not be messed with. In the 1790s, there also emerged this question of how to respond to the French Revolution that was going on. Now, the French Revolution followed the American Revolution. It was not cause and effect, although many Americans like to think that the French were inspired by what had happened by their revolutionary cousins in America. Now, as the Federalists watched that the overthrow of the monarchy and the execution of the king and the queen and the aristocracy coming under attack, there was this fear of, oh my God, we're sort of the American aristocracy. We don't want that to happen here. So they were very much against the French Revolution. The Democratic Republicans, with their leaders, Thomas Jefferson, who was a Francophile, generally supported this democratic, anti-aristocratic spirit that was going on in the French Revolution. Now, as it got bloodier and bloodier, they tended to support it less, but there was a division between the first two parties. The additional division that we saw was the fact that they were geographically separated. The Federalists, more of the commercial elites, tended to be in the Northeast, as well as some southern seaports like Charleston, whereas the Republicans tended to be sort of your dirty, dusty farmers in the South and in the, quote, West. And as the French Revolution grew bigger and it grew outside of France, it brought England and France in opposition again, which they had been in often, most recently in the French and Indian War. And the question was, who will America support if it came down to Britain versus France? Now, remember, of course, that we had been in bed with the British for a very long time, and then as a result of the Declaration of Independence, and then later the Treaty of Paris, which officially made us independent, we'd been with the British. But we were only got out of bed with the British because we got French help as a result of the Franco-American alliance that was signed after the Battle of Saratoga during the Revolutionary War. So technically, we were obliged to go with the French. Yet George Washington looked at the situation and he said, we can't afford to be with either side right now. Not that we're anti-French or anti-British or pro-British or pro-French. We need to be pro-American. This country is too young to get itself involved in a war. If we get ourselves involved in a war and we lose, this whole Republican, as with a little r, Republic experiment could be over. So this was really a pragmatic approach based on the youth and inexperience of this country so far. So Washington opted for neutrality, where he basically said it's against the law for anyone to go with the British or the French, which of course pissed off many Federalists, like Hamilton, who wanted us to go with the British, and pissed off many Francophiles, like Jefferson, who expected that based on this alliance, we would go with the French. Now, there's a famous example of the French being pissed off or not even willing to accept our overall neutrality that Washington said in the Neutrality Act, and we see the Citizen Genet affair. Now, you're going to see sort of a diplomat, Edmond Genet, come from revolutionary France over to America. He goes to the South. He really tries to recruit people to help the French defeat the British. This is against the Neutrality Act. This is very explicitly against what Washington has said. And in fact, he is called to Washington, and Washington sort of lambasts him for what he's doing. And in the process, it makes people like Jefferson not look very good because they're supposed to be supporting the French, yet you have these guys who came over and are really sort of spitting in the face of George Washington and his neutrality. So it shows just how difficult it was to overall maintain neutrality. And in terms of maintaining neutrality, the British aren't really willing to accept it either. So the British ships start seizing a bunch of American ships that they think are trading with the French in the West Indies. And so you've got this overall concern that not only do we have problems with the French sending their ambassadors over here and trying to recruit people, but you've got problems with the British who seem to be trying to recruit Native Americans on the western frontier to, quote, help get their land back. So what you're going to have is you're going to have a delegation of Americans led by John Jay that are going to go to Britain. And they're like, Britain, you got to stop this. You've got to get your troops off of the frontier. You've got to stop taking our ships. And at the end of the day, this Jay's Treaty is sort of undone by perhaps some subterfuge by Alexander Hamilton that's not terribly important, but it does sort of settle the conflict. There's no war, but it doesn't really get the British to agree to be done with their forts. And so many Americans looked at Jay's Treaty as a failure. They said, we went to England, we negotiated, we really didn't get what we wanted, and at the end of the day, it looks like we sort of bowed down to the British, which is a problem because we're a sovereign nation and we want to be able to stand on our own 2 feet. The reaction to Jay's Treaty is actually sort of the lowest point of George Washington's time as president because it looked like we weren't strong, whereas the Neutrality Act, some could say you're being a coward. He was saying, no, we're trying to really maintain our strength. It looked like we went to Britain and didn't have the strength to stand up to their monarchy. In 1796, George Washington was faced with a question. Do I continue as president? There's no term limits. People liked him. Aside from Jay's Treaty, he was generally popular overall. But he said, I've served a long time for this country. It's time for me to go home to Mount Vernon. Now, in his farewell address, which is not actually a speech so much as it's something written by Hamilton that goes in a newspaper, he made some really enduring claims. One, he said, you know what? Political parties aren't good, Okay, factions are one thing, but parties will really tear this republic asunder. In addition, he said, you know what? Don't get involved in entangling alliances. It's okay to be involved with other countries for a short period of time, but you want nothing that's permanent. And this whole idea is something that actually sticks with American foreign policy well into the 20th century. But once Washington's gone, it's like, okay, what do we do now? Now you've got two parties that have emerged. They really coalesce around opposition to Fat White Bus Man and support for Fat White Bus Man, as well as other controversies like the French Revolution. We know that Jefferson's going to be head of the Democratic Republicans. Is Hamilton going to be head of the Federalists? Well, he seems to have too many enemies, so it falls to the Vice President, John Adams. Adams, in the election of 1796, which is quite a dirty election in terms of really insults being passed back and forth, Adams wins, but Jefferson gets second. So you've got this very awkward situation where you have a Federalist president and you have a Democratic Republican vice president. This will later be changed in the 12th Amendment in the early 1800s, but at that time it created, again, an awkward situation. Now, one main issue that John Adams faced as president is that French ships kept taking American ships, just as we had seen British taking American ships before. Again, really didn't have freedom of the seas because America didn't have a strong navy and was really vulnerable out on the seas. So what I want you to understand is, how do you go from French taking ships all the way through something called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution? So I'm going to explain it here, okay? So America is mad at the French, and just as we'd been mad at the British and went to Britain to try to negotiate a treaty, we send a delegation that goes to France. And we want to talk to their leader, Talleyrand. We want to ask for them to stop doing this. But they're met by agents that are later called X, Y, and Z. And these people demand a tribute, essentially a bribe of $250,000, not to get the French seizure of ships to stop, just to talk to Talleyrand. And the American delegation says, no, we're not going to pay that. They're very indignant, they're very proud. We will pay millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. So this inspires an anti-French hysteria at home. How dare the French both take our ships and demand a bribe? Well, it's important to note that the people that supported the French in America were the Democratic Republicans. So if you have anti-French hysteria, it can really transfer over to anti-Democratic Republican feelings. Now, the Federalists are no dummies. They go, well, let's seize upon this anti-French hysteria to really attack our political opponents, the Democratic Republicans. So they passed two sets of acts. The Alien Acts, which are designed to increase the number of years it takes to become a citizen, also gave the president broad powers to expel citizens in time of crisis. What's important to know about that is immigrants tended to be the supporters of the Democratic Republicans. So if you limit immigrants' power and their rights, overall you're actually limiting the Democratic Republican rights. In addition, they passed the Sedition Act, which really said you couldn't criticize the Federalist government. So what they've done is they've taken away the potential supporters for the Democratic Republicans and made it so they can't criticize the Federalists in power. Well, of course, people like Madison and Jefferson are outraged. How dare you do this? They said, this goes against the First Amendment. The Supreme Court said, well, we don't really see it that way, seeing as though the Supreme Court was led by Federalists. But Jefferson and Madison say, you know what? We're going to do something about this. We're going to write a series of resolutions. Madison wrote them in Virginia. Jefferson wrote them in Kentucky. And what they said here was, the Constitution didn't exist until states voted it in. So that means that states came together in what is known as a compact to create the Constitution. Therefore, if the government does anything that we believe sort of violates the spirit of this compact, we can say no to that law. Essentially, this is an argument that says the states can declare any law passed by Congress to be unconstitutional. Now, at that point, there was some real disagreement. Who gets to declare stuff unconstitutional? Is it the Supreme Court or is it the states? At the end of the day, these resolutions went nowhere. They didn't get picked up by other states. And the Alien and Sedition, the Alien and Sedition Acts stayed on the books. That being said, Jefferson's going to come into power in the election of 1800, and those acts are going to go by the wayside. But this idea of compact theory, of states having the power to declare congressional laws unconstitutional, will live on, and we're going to see that throughout the 1800s. This second review goes from 1783, at the end of the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris, all the way through 1787, the Constitutional Convention, through 1789, ratification of the Constitution. I got into it a little bit in the last review, but I'm going to go into much greater detail about the Articles of Confederation. As we've talked about, this idea of a confederation is where the power really is with the states. The idea was that many people in the new country did not want to revert back to a strong central government as they felt had oppressed them with Britain. So they created essentially an association of independent sovereign states. Really, the power was with the states. And in this document, which set up the government, which was also the name of the government, the Confederation government, each state only had one vote regardless of their population. There was only one house or a unicameral Congress. They had no real strong president, although there was nominally a president, and they had no judicial branch. Now, this intentionally weak Congress could do a few things, one of which it could declare war, it could make treaties, and it could ask to borrow money from the states. But at the end of the day, it was incredibly weak because it couldn't actually demand troops from the states. It couldn't levy taxes, and it couldn't regulate trade. These are real problems for any country that wants to be taken seriously overall. And at the end of the day, the real challenges came from the fact that they couldn't control sort of too much power with the people. And the best example of this will be seen in Shays' Rebellion. Now, Shays' Rebellion, like previous rebellions that we have seen, particularly Bacon's Rebellion, is a poor farmer rebellion, and it's sort of in western Massachusetts where people who'd fought in the war felt like they weren't getting paid quick enough. They were being taxed, their crop prices were low, and so in an effort to sort of stick it to the man, they said, we're going to actually try to capture the courthouses so that they can't actually continue to take our property from us when we don't have enough money to pay. Now, the idea that there was sort of an armed insurrection out west of Boston was very troubling to many of the wealthier people of Boston, many of whom had actually been part of the original revolution in the 1770s. What they had to do was they had to actually hire soldiers to go out and put down this rebellion because the federal government was too weak to actually do it itself. Now, what this showed, much like when you saw Bacon's Rebellion about 100 years earlier, it was a turning point moving from the indentured servitude to slavery. This was a turning point saying, you know what, this Articles of Confederation, this try at a intentionally weak government really won't work. We need to try to actually create a stronger central government to really protect our interests. Yet before we go to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention, it is important to recognize that there was one major strength, if you can call it that, of the Articles of Confederation, and that was the organization of the land that was known as the Northwest Territory. Of course, I would like it to be renamed North Mideast Territory, but we'll stick with the old historic name, Northwest Territory, and what's known as the Northwest Ordinance. Now, there's two bits together. There's the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. We'll just refer to it all as the Northwest Ordinance. Now, what was noteworthy about these actions taken in the North Midwest that we now know is that first and foremost, it was a way to divide up the area. And so land would be surveyed and divided into these little sort of 6 square mile towns, and then each township had 36 sections, each of which was a square mile, and one of those 36 sections would be sold to support public education. So that's one of the major achievements, was the focus on public education. In addition, there was no slavery allowed in the Northwest Territory. There was religious freedom that was promised. And in addition, it was a way to show how you could take a territory that could move into a state. So once you basically had 5,000 adults, a district became a territory. And then once you had 60,000 adults, a territory could write a constitution and apply for statehood, which actually was a precedent set for sort of how to organize new lands. So when you think of the Northwest Ordinance, you think of emphasis on public education, anti-slavery, religious freedom, and how to organize area and later sort of officially bring it into the United States. Now we return to this question of what to do with this Articles of Confederation, which showed itself to be too weak overall. Now, there was no actual explicit effort to write a new constitution. Instead, people got together in Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. It was only supposed to be an update, revision, not scrapping it and coming up with something entirely new. Now, much like we'd seen previously, not all of the states attended. Rhode Island was opposed to any of this idea, so they didn't show up. And at this particular convention, there are a number of different sides. So you have your big states versus your small states. And the big states put forward a plan called the Virginia Plan, which would give more power ultimately to the big states in terms of representation. So the more people that you had, the more representatives you would have. The small states obviously objected to this. They didn't like the idea that they would be totally dominated by the big states. So they said, you know what? We'd like to propose a system where it's actually based on everybody gets the same amount, much as that had been under the Articles of Confederation. So in what's known as the Great Compromise, which took the Virginia Plan, the large states plan, and the New Jersey Plan, the small state plan, and compromised, they came up with what was known as a bicameral legislature, two houses. One is the House, one is the Senate. The House would be based on population. The Senate, every state would get 2 senators that would be in the Senate. Now, important parts that you need to know about that is the House members would serve for 2 years, the senators would serve for 6 years. So after they settled sort of this question of how are we going to be represented, they had to have a compromise between the northern and southern states. Obviously, the southern states wanted to benefit from the population that they had in terms of slaves, which meant that the more people that were counted in the southern states, the more power they would have in the House, which is based on population. The North didn't like this. The South also didn't want to have to pay any taxes on their slaves, whereas the North wanted to punish them that way and have them pay for their taxes. So the South wanted to have slaves count as 1 when it came to population for political representation, as 0, and when it came to taxation, the North wanted the inverse. So of course, they split it right down the middle and got 3/5, which meant that African Americans would be counted as 3/5 of white people when it came to political representation and taxation. Now, also decided at the Constitutional Convention were 3 important clauses, one of which was known as the Interstate Commerce Clause, which gave the federal government the power to regulate interstate, that means trade between states. Now, this had been a problem under the Articles of Confederation when they didn't have this power, and states basically waged economic warfare against each other. In addition, there is the Supremacy Clause, which means when a state law and a federal law are in conflict with each other, the state law reigns supreme. Last but not least is something known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, aka the Elastic Clause, aka the Implied Powers Clause, which essentially says that the federal government has a number of explicit or enumerated powers. One of those powers is to be able to do whatever is, quote, necessary and proper to actually put into effect those explicit powers. Now, again, it's a way to really allow the federal government to do what is unwritten so that it can actually execute what is written. Now, together, the Commerce Clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause all gave the federal government far more power overall than you would have originally seen under the idea of federalism. Now, federalism is that idea that we saw with the Venn diagram where state and federal governments share power. So, of course, on the federal side, the Washington, D.C. side, you saw WMD-TTT, war powers, money powers, defense powers, abilities to make treaties, regulate trade, and execute tariffs. Now, down the middle, the shared powers, you saw the alert with the little a. So you saw punishing lawbreakers, protecting the environment, protecting people's rights, and taxes. And on the right-hand side of that Venn diagram, if you recall the state powers, you had EDM, like a goat at an EDM show, where you have elections, education, driver's license, and marriage. Now, I regret that I failed to inform you earlier when it was talking about what was decided in terms of the structure of the government, that as part of the Great Compromise, it was not only decided that there would be a House decided by representation of population and Senate, which would be 2 from each state, but that there'd be 3 branches. Now, the House and the Senate make up the legislative branch, the branch that makes the laws. The executive branch is the president, executes the laws, and the judicial branch is essentially going to be the Supreme Court that interprets the laws. We'll find out much more about the Supreme Court later on when they get more powers in 1803 with something called judicial review. The main checks and balances that you need to understand between the branches, at least at the beginning, was that no laws would actually go into effect without the president's signature. So the president had the ability to check Congress, yet at the same time, Congress could override a presidential veto if they got enough support. At the same time, the Congress could actually impeach a president. That means to accuse them, and then there's a process for removing the president. We have never actually had a president removed from office. So you had this new Constitution. Not supposed to have it, we're supposed to just revise the Articles of Confederation, but there was this new Constitution. So the question became, how are we going to actually get the people to agree to this? So the idea was they were going to send it out to all of the 13 states. And in each of these states, there'd be special conventions made up of people who would actually vote on this. It would not go to state congresses, it would go to these special state conventions. And you would have to get 9 out of 13 to ratify this particular new set of rules, the Constitution, before it would go into effect. And there were 2 sides. They're factions. They're not political parties. They're groups organized for the purpose of a specific action. In this case, it was either ratifying the Constitution, the Federalists, or not ratifying it, the Anti-Federalists. And the Federalists came from this idea of the people that actually wrote the Constitution. They emphasized that a strong central government was needed to maintain order, that there was too much sort of mobocracy or potential of that, as we saw in Shays' Rebellion. They pointed to all of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, with its inability to regulate trade, to its inability to actually levy taxes, to its inability to really have troops for war. Some of the great minds were there supporting it. People like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. They had their support in the cities, and they were really well organized overall. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, complained, much like the revolutionaries had, against Britain, that basically a strong national government would lead to a kind of tyranny, exactly the kind that they fought against back in the Revolution. They said, look, if you have a strong central government, that government's going to abuse states' rights and individual liberties. And look, it's just a bunch of elite, educated, wealthy folks. We're just poor farmers who distrust any sort of central authority. So you really had sort of the haves, in some cases, versus the have-nots. The Anti-Federalists were particularly concerned with the absence of a Bill of Rights. They said, if there are not explicit protections offered by the federal government, we think that we are going to be abused. But since the ratification process was only a yes or no, not a yes but, they basically had to go on faith that if they said yes to the Constitution, that they could get this Bill of Rights added during the first Congress. Now, there was a specific effort in New York being a large and influential state, in terms of getting New York to ratify. There were strong anti-federalist support against the Constitution. Now, famously, people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay wrote what were known as the Federalist Papers. They were specifically for New York, not for the rest of the states. And the main idea of the Federalist Number 10, which is a specific paper written by Madison, was whereas there was an argument that prevailed that said that a republic, which is really power to the people, could only survive in a small nation, he said, no, no, no. A republic would actually be best in a large nation where all these small groups would emerge and they would really check each other. So the fact that there'd be small groups that could sort of check each other's power would make it so that they could never actually be abused. Really turned the idea of what a republic could be on its head, and ultimately New York did ratify the Constitution. Now, the Constitution was ratified ultimately by 11 out of the 13 states, and during that first Congress, as the Anti-Federalists had wanted, and as the Federalists promised would happen, there were 10 amendments that were immediately added to the Constitution. They had to go through a process, but they were ultimately added, and they're known as the Bill of Rights. From the First Amendment for freedom of religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech, to the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and the Third Amendment, protection against having to quarter soldiers, and the Fourth Amendment, protection from unreasonable search and seizures. Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. Sixth and Seventh Amendment have to do with the right to an attorney and a speedy and public trial. The Eighth Amendment protected citizens from cruel and unusual punishment. 9 is sort of complicated, but 10 is this very important amendment, particularly for states' rights, that says if a power is not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution, it is, quote, reserved for the states. So the 10th Amendment became known as the Reserved Powers Amendment, which became very important in Jefferson's fight with Hamilton over this battle between central government authority and states' rights.